The Saar Offensive was a limited French invasion of Germany in September 1939. Note that sources for this offensive are generally very thin and outdated. Luckily, during one of my trips to the German military archive, supported by my Patreon supporters, I found a German report about the French combat effectiveness and other observations. So first, a bit of context, and then we look at the document. When Germany prepared for war in August 1939, the main force was amassed at the German-Polish border. In the west, the troops were intended to secure the borders with France, Belgium and Luxembourg. This was also be done even without the Western Allies declaring war. A total of about 31.5 divisions were sent. After the declaration of war by France and the United Kingdom, the force was expanded to a total of about 43 divisions. These were under the command of Heeresgruppe C, Army Group C. The situation of the French was as follows. After 3 weeks of war, when the mobilization and deployment that began in August 21st were reasonably complete, Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the Allies in France, could command 51 active divisions and 37 reserve divisions in metropolitan France. 10 formations secured the Alpine front against Italy, a good dozen occupied forces, so that there would have been about 65 divisions available for an attack against Germany. This attack, however, was from the outset not intended. Gamelin assumed that the Allies would need until fall 1941 to be strong enough for an offensive. He considered the German Westwall and the Rhine Valley as insurmountable. One of his plans was that offensives in Eastern and Southeastern Europe would force Germany to split its forces, yet the Hitler-Stalin Pact and Italy's stance made countries in that region rather reluctant. The United Kingdom took also a rather defensive stance in general. Thus, for the time being, the Allied initiative was limited to skirmishes on the Franco-German border. French patrols first advanced across the Reich border between the Moselle and the Palatine Forest on September 6th. The attack continued with troops in battalions rank, so that the German Army Group C initially feared that the enemy was preparing a large-scale offensive. Yet the French only performed minor advances towards in the direction of Saar-Louise. Poland wanted a stronger French offensive, but Gamelin, aware of the German success in Poland, questioned how useful that would be and was more concerned with securing French territory. Around mid-September, the French switched to a defensive stance, and around mid-October, they started to retreat. So let us look at the document. It is dated 20th September 1939, classified as secret, and from the Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, the military intelligence department for the Western Front. Note, there was also Foreign Armies East, but none for South or North. The title is rather short. Not just kidding, after all it's a proper title. Observations about the combat methods and combat effectiveness of the French troops and behavior of friendly troops during combat operations in the West until 16th September 1939. Now the first paragraph puts the whole document into the proper context. The experience gained so far can only be used to a very limited extent for the future. The fighting method and the behavior of the French was to a great extent dependent on political and psychological considerations. The Frenchman undoubtedly intended to lead his own troops very cautiously into the fire for the first time. Probably the political or military leadership also wanted to avoid major fighting at all for the time being. Whether this intention will continue for a longer time or will be changed with the arrival of the English cannot yet be foreseen. A little note here, in the original there was generally no space after punctuation, which I think I haven't encountered before in Wehrmacht's documents, or at least I don't remember it, since I likely did not transcribe those documents. So it seems the Germans were highly aware of the situation at the time. The next part is about the French combat methods. It starts with remarks on how the French troops established contact with the German troops. It is noted that first only small recon squads and units up to platoon and company size were used, which was contrary to French army regulations. Not as expected according to regulations, with stronger reconnaissance battalions or individual battalions. Note, the Germans called non-infantry units in battalion size Abteilungen, so the first sensation likely refers to a non-infantry battalion, whereas the second one refers to an infantry battalion, whose action was supervised and covered by larger elements of the artillery. The report notes that these limited advances with rather small units were the reason that the French could barely take any substantial ground in the first 2 days. Be aware that the German army in pre-war studied French regulations. I know of at least one article about pre-war French doctrine. The next paragraph is about the following engagements that started on the 10th September. It is particularly remarkable that these operations were according to French regulations, and even note in a footnote the numbers and the name of the regulations. It continues. Individual tank platoons and tank companies work closely with the infantry. Parts of the divisional artillery, in one case apparently the entire divisional artillery, supported the infantry's partial attacks. Now, as you might know, early to mid-war German doctrine was to keep all the tanks within the panzer divisions. This was contrary to French doctrine. Tanks played a vital role in 1918 French victory and so remained a central element of infantry doctrine. The Inspector General of the Infantry in 1938 remarked that my profound conviction is that these machines are destined to play a decisive role in future conflict. The infantry was unable to do without tanks in the last war, and will be even less in future operations. The tank must be the preferred arm in a nation poor in personnel. War is a question of force, where the advantage rests with the most powerful machine and not with the most rapid machine. This was quite different to German doctrine, which is even apparent from the organization and naming. The German tank arm was organized until a later organization in the branch of the Schnellen Truppen, literally fast troops, yet also translated with mobile troops. Back to the German report. It notes that since 13th September, the French started to dig in at the positions they had taken, yet remarked those were usually just 3 to 5 kilometers, so 1.9 to 3.1 miles away from the border. Yet, only in a few places along others near Büshdorf, 6 km eastwards Pearl, he tried to gain some ground by single advances. In other places he voluntarily gave up some gained ground again, no doubt with the intention of not exposing advanced parts to German operations. This concludes the first part. The next part is about the behavior of the infantry, tanks and artillery. About the infantry, it is noted that there is little Angriffslust, literally lust for attack, desire for attack. Yet probably the most useful translation is that it lacks aggressiveness. Additionally, it is noted that assembling is done sometimes carelessly, as such German artillery is able to attack. It continues with more positive remarks. Very skillfully, the French infantryman exploits the terrain, working his way forward with rushes and crawling through all covers and depressions to hand grenade throwing range. Equally skillfully and very quickly, he digs in deep and camouflages himself at every stop. Yet the accuracy of rifle and machine gun fire is regarded as bad by the German infantrymen. Particularly, it is noted that the French aimed too high. Additionally, the weapons of prisoners of war were often in bad shape. As particularly annoying was mentioned that the French riflemen and machine gunners fired from trees. French mortars and submachine guns were considered as good weapons. Finally, it is noted with emphasis by underlining, the Frenchman is particularly sensitive to hasty counterattacks of even weak units. Important here, the Germans made a clear distinction between a Gegenstoß, translated with hasty counterattack, and a Gegenangriff, a counterattack. The hasty counterattack was done immediately with local reserves and little to no preparation, whereas the regular counterattack involved reserves from the rear area and also supported by more planning. The next part is about tanks. Here it is noted that of French tanks, only the light tank Renault 35 have so far been detected with certainty. In some places, perhaps only reconnaissance vehicles appeared. According to Sanoga, the Renault R35 was the most numerous and important French infantry tank for the Battle of France. I assume this statement is also valid for fall 1939 or even more so. About 1,500 of these tanks were delivered, including export variants before the fall of France in June 1940. Although this tank had a turret with a 37mm gun, it only had a crew of 2 men with a weight of 10.6 metric tons. It had almost double the weight of a Panzer I, whereas a Panzer II had about 8.6 metric tons. With a frontal armor of 40mm, it was well armored at the time. A Panzer III only had around 30mm. Anyway, let's continue with the report. In almost all cases, the tank platoons and companies were closely with the infantry. They drove a little ahead, but then stopped, although if possible in marginal positions that revealed only their turrets, and kept so far away from German defenses that they could not be effectively engaged by anti-tank guns. I think that is the first time ever that I read that tank-infantry cooperation worked well. Considering the frontal armor of 40mm and that the common German anti-tank gun at the time was the 37mm Pak 36, it is not surprising that it was ineffective. The report although continues to note that due to that distance the machine gun and gunfire of the R-35 was also rather ineffective as well. It is noted that a few times the R-35 came very close and skillfully used terrain for cover, yet those tanks that came into effective range of the anti-tank guns were usually destroyed. The report also notes that shots bounced due to the strength and sloping of the armor. Let's move to the artillery. The French artillery is generally characterized by rapid, well-placed and maneuverable fire. Fire concentrations of several batteries and battalions on individual areas of the terrain are very rapid. It is added that the firepower of the French field gun is without doubt less than that of the German leichte Feldhaubitze, likely referring to the leichte Feldhaubitze 18 with 105mm. In contrast, the regular French light artillery of the infantry division was a field gun with 75mm. It also noted that the artillery spotter aircraft were used skillfully. Furthermore, it is noted that in some cases divisional artillery was moved forward to be used in close support due to a lack of infantry support guns like the German leichte Infanteriegeschütz 18, which I discussed in this video with Jens Wehner. To summarize, the preamble of the document about the limits of this report seems to be spot on. The various other observations don't seem particularly out of place based on the information available. Some remarks are positive, whereas others are not. Although I must add I have little knowledge on the state of the French army in 1939 and particularly units that the Germans engaged in the Saar Offensive. Well, I hope you learned something new. Thank you to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, sources are listed in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.